So having discussed this liquidity ratio, now let's move to the solvency ratio. So on one hand we had discussed short-term obligations. Here we have the company's ability to pay long-term obligations being gauged by the solvency ratios. So the very first solvency ratio would be something like this: debt to equity ratio. So here in the numerator you'll have total debt, and in the denominator you'll have total equity. So what does this measure actually imply? If total debt upon equity is, let's say, 2:1, this would mean that for every $1 of equity you have $2 as debt. So this measure provides us a way or a bifurcation of how this funding has taken place. Funding of resources have taken place. So this has taken place using 2 times debt and 1 time equity. So this is how debt to equity can be interpreted. Now many of the analysts, when they talk about total debt, they take different definitions with respect to total debt. Some only take the long portion of debt. Majority include the long portion, plus there could be short portion of debt. So short term debt is also included here. So this is the typical definition. We'll take the total debt as short-term debt as well as the long portion of debt, both of them included. There could be certain obligations like lease obligations, which are also listed on the balance sheet. We'll avoid using that for the time being. Our definition of total debt would only include short-term debt and long-term debt, and total equity is the total shareholders equity which we have in the formula in the balance sheet. So this was one. Number two, another ratio, which is the debt to capital ratio. Now what is debt? The debt on the numerator is basically total debt, and the capital is basically the source of funding. So we're talking about not only the total debt amount, which is one source of funding, but we are also talking about the total equity. So here this provides us with a clear measure of how much percentage has been financed by debt. So whether the company has a higher reliance or a lesser reliance on debt as a source of financing. So apart from this debt to capital ratio, there could be something called financial leverage ratios. So I'll call this as financial leverage ratio, and this can be calculated using the average total assets divided by your average total equity. So just let's pause for a moment and understand, what does this financial leverage actually means. Financial leverage essentially provides us with an information that how much of your assets is basically financed by debt, and the risk is being shared by the equity holders or debt holders. So greater the use of debt, greater will be this number. So if greater is the use of debt, this number will be really high and it will be financially leveraged. So let's move on and look at the other important ratios when we talk about solvency. This is very interesting and very famous: interest coverage ratio. Interest coverage ratio is calculated as earnings before interest and taxes divided by your interest payments. So this measure essentially checks that whether you have sufficient earnings to pay your interest. So say for example your EBIT was 500 and your interest payment was 100. So this will come out to be 5 times. So this means that you have sufficient earnings before interest to pay off your interest obligations. So many companies do track interest coverage so that whether these obligations will be met or not. So lower this number, lower number is undesirable, higher number is desirable. Okay, so let's move and look at a tweak in the interest coverage ratio. There is a term called fixed charge coverage. Now what is this fixed charge coverage? The fixed charge coverage is nothing but EBIT, and this takes care of your lease payments as well. So lease payments are included in the numerator, and in the denominator we also include the lease payments. So what we are doing here is that these payments are again some things which you must pay for an asset which you may have taken on lease. Now this EBIT would have already deducted lease payments. So we need to add this back so that the numerator has an element of not only the EBIT, and it comes up to a number where lease is not deducted from EBIT. Now in the denominator we have taken these two obligations, interest expense as well as the lease payments which are due. So when these two are added in the numerator and the denominator, this gives us the total fixed charge coverage. So this is better than the interest coverage, because interest coverage only limits itself to the debt holders. Here we are also talking about the obligations from the lease payments point of view.